Welcome. Hello. I'm just gonna start because we have 1.5 hours, which is really great, but at the same time, it will overlap a little bit with the lunch break. So I don't want to keep you too long, so you still have time to get your sandwiches. So let's just start right away. Welcome. Thanks a lot for joining us in this classroom on digital misogyny versus pluralistic media. My name is Haas. I'm with the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media. And I'm really very excited to be here at this great Congress, first of all, but also in this room with all of you to discuss what we can do as different stakeholders, but also really as collective stakeholders coming together to respond to gender disinformation and online attacks, online violence against women journalists specifically. I really intend to have this very informally and really very interactive. So I'm very grateful for the many people who are here, and with many we also already briefly spoke before. We have two introductory expert speakers who will bring in their perspective. I also sent out a concept note with questions. I'm not sure if everybody received it. I can also refer to the questions later on. But the intention of this hour and a half is really to discuss how we can kind of like close the gaps and bring together the different perspective, the different stakeholders and initiatives that are out there, because I think we have all heard this morning and over the course of the last 2 days, but we also all know that online attacks against journalists and particularly women journalists is unfortunately a reality that impacts not only them individually, but really the information spaces and the plurality of voices out there, which is a crucial impact for democracy and democratic processes, which is also the perspective that we are taking at the OSCE. I will just say three very brief things about the OSCE RFoM, but I don't want to promote our work too much. I brought some publications. One is the issue on online safety of women journalists that we've worked on for quite a while now, and we developed this research guide that tries to identify what different stakeholders can and should be doing to better address the issue. We also work a lot on content governance and the question of automated content governance and how this is impact our information spaces and really creates challenges for pluralism, for disinformation, as I think we've heard plenty of times over the course of the last days, and our information spaces and right to access to information. And one last thing that I wanted to say is that in the beginning of this year, the OSCE representative, together with the other free speech mandate holders, issued a joint declaration on gender justice, which was really the very first time that the 4 international media and free speech watchdogs and mandate holders came together to say there is a need, or to recognize that there's a need for a transformative change when we want to speak about inclusive information spaces and inclusive and pluralistic media. So that's everything from my side for now. Please feel free to grab a publication afterwards. They are also all online, of course. And with this, I will open up by first giving the floor to Courtney to my left. I think you are all very familiar with her. She also already was involved in the previous discussions and days, is a fellow with, I mean, you have different affiliation, but currently also with UCLA Technology, Law and Policy. And I would be very grateful if you could kind of help us to briefly set the scene by really saying, what are we talking about when we speak about gender disinformation, especially in the online context, the role that platforms play in this regard, and why it matters, what is the impact of it?
Sure, thanks so much. And it's great to see this work being done by the OSCE and to see all of you here, so thank you. I wrote a paper earlier this year for the OSCE looking at AI and disinformation, specifically in state-sponsored coordinated information operations, because I think one of the things we've seen in terms of the evolving tactics and strategies is this is no longer something that individual journalists can deal with with themselves. There's been a lot of progress made for individual type attacks. But the fact is that state-sponsored disinformation campaigns are increasingly common in political systems of all types. More than 70 countries have weaponized political information operations, and there is a multi-billion-dollar industry of reputation management and Black PR firms. So that's the context that we're working in. It is a different context than it was a few years ago. Couple that with the design of the platforms themselves. So, we talk a lot about AI and machine learning. We talk about online harassment, but I think it's important to actually delve into what we really mean by those terms. So if we're thinking about online harassment, there are a topology that really came out of my work at CPJ, but which I've really tried to think through further, because disinformation and online harassment are currently treated as kind of two separate things, but in fact, they're really similar things. They are implicated within each other. So in the topology, I want to give that first and then talk about how AI comes into that in a different way. So abuse, these are like verbal, image-based attacks, using secret platforms to coordinate. We see that a lot. The use of messaging, encrypted messaging app platforms, or secret Facebook groups, coordination takes place, then goes out and spreads. This is a dynamic we need the platforms to address and we need to recognize. Similarly, you see exclusion. Exclusion is this idea about manipulating technology, the terms of service, to somehow kick journalists off of the platform, make a website inaccessible through DDoS attacks, use a fake copyright claim, a DMCA claim to get something taken down. You heard yesterday during the Ukraine war, 200,000 DDoS attacks or requests every second in the first 2 days of the war. This is an exclusion type of approach. Distributed denial of service is an example of that. Smearing, the shaming, etc. And then you see the evolution of synthetic media is we have to get ahead of that, because you've got increasingly sophisticated and cheaper web-based consumer technologies that can be used to create synthetic media. That's audio, visual, and of course, we know the written form, which can be great for journalists on a budget to use AI, but also really challenging when it's used to target journalists. So we need to get out ahead of that, because synthetic media, no one is ready for, especially audio. I would highlight that. If you think about journalists being particularly at risk, it's because they have a lot of presence online. There's a lot of digital information, which means you can make really good synthetic media of their voices and their visuals if you're a broadcast journalist. And of course, doxing, and then gender disinformation. Gender disinformation essentially plays on all of the tropes that all of the people here are familiar with, in terms of using the idea of positioning women and trying to exclude them from having a right to participate in the public sphere. So then how does AI play into this? I mean, basically AI, there are recommender systems, there are search systems. Those are kind of two of the main ones where you see this coming in. Recommender systems rely on machine learning for how they recommend content to other people. So you see that these coordinated campaigns are designed at influencing recommendation systems through machine learning, through either, well, increasingly, not through exclusion, but through dumping all of this information out there. So you see fake news websites, you see all of this content from these moderation mercenaries, as I call them, the information operations. This will influence the recommendation algorithm. This makes it harder for journalism to be visible, and it makes it harder for journalists to kind of get through the mass of crap, basically. And because machine learning depends on these basic data sets, most of the data sets are created from news information, like information online. So that's news, Twitter data sets. If you're a poorly resourced language online, that means that the machine learning for your language is going to be worse. So in Ethiopia, for example, there are 6 major languages. Facebook only has resources for 2 of those, but more broadly, the machine learning corpus that's being used to train a lot of our AI systems is based on English language, either raw data or learning. And it's not clear that that can then translate into meaningful AI learning in other languages. And a big question I have, which I think I would love to see more research into, is how does the prevalence of online harassment in some of these corpus, in these language data, from the state-owned media that are part of this online harassment ecosystem, from all the Twitter data sets that include this harassment, which are then used to train data, which are to train machine learning. And as many of you have probably heard, the autofill, if you put in some sort of, thing that will, if you say, Black woman in it, it will fill in some really negative things after that, as Sophia Noble's algorithms of oppression showed. So we have to really interrogate, I think, at a much more basic level, how these organizations, these platforms are conveying, are putting their resources into which languages, because we know that online harassment is overwhelmingly targeting women, as we know, and women in the global South who are really under-resourced in their newsrooms and in the broader advocacy community to deal with those issues. And I mean, I know Jeff's going to talk about Facebook, so I won't go into that, but just to say 86% of Facebook's resources are put towards English. That has a profound impact, especially when you know that women are communicating in many different languages online. And so we see much less ability to deal with online harassment in non-English languages.
Thanks so much for this broad overview. I mean, I think there are several things that we could have a full hour discussion on, and I think a lot of things that really will also probably come throughout this conversation. But I just want to pick on two things that you mentioned that I think are particularly relevant and also link very nicely to our second introductory speaker. First of all, I think it's really important that you underline this intersectional impact, which is has the gender perspective, but then again the language perspective, and really the question on which data is the AI being trained on, and that this can then really perpetuate or amplify the existing biases in our society, especially on the global scale, and also amplify the existing harmful gender narratives. And you also referred to already the platforms and the role of the platforms in this. And of course, Facebook has been one of the biggest and biggest platform on a global scale that provides this kind of like private, public, open spaces for communication and for information. And there is a lot of research being done. And now we know a little bit more on the impact of how information is being curated and moderated on these platforms, including the impact it has also on, or the silencing impact or potential silencing impact this has on individuals and specific groups. Can you maybe, so Jeff, sorry, I didn't introduce you, because you also maybe, all of you already followed you in the opening plenary this morning, which was excellent. And you referred to many things that I think will also resonate in today's conversation. But can you give us a little bit of your take in the discussions we are having here now?
Yeah, sure. So at the beginning, let's just acknowledge, as a white American male, obviously what I have to say here is going to be based on understanding and the research I've done into Facebook's internal. Obviously I do not. Obviously, I do not have much experience with the actual awfulness of some of this stuff. Every once in a while, someone calls me a Jew, which is like only half accurate, and it's very funny to me. But other than that, it's really a world away from, I'm sure, what probably most of you have all received in this room. With Facebook, I mean, it's very important to draw a distinction between the top-down stuff, which is going to be coordinated by, say, state actors. I think that's by far a very small minority of the overall issues that women are going to run into online. I mean, some of this is not algorithmic, right? Like inside of WhatsApp, WhatsApp realized that having female presenting photo of oneself as your little WhatsApp icon in a group resulted in like exponentially more harassment. That's obviously not, that was in India that they found that. That's obviously not an algorithm issue or a machine learning issue. That's just a crap type issue. Like we're still pretty awful as human beings and what have you. So it's not, and in terms of the bulk of the issue, I think, in what's sort of different with Meta and its platforms, and this is going to apply elsewhere as well, is that by giving everyone who really, really wants it a microphone, and I think this is one of the things that the platform. It can be used for good, but frankly, I'm not totally sure it generally is. Hyperactivity is rewarded. And it turns out that the nastiest sons of bitches are also the ones who are most active. Facebook's internal research found that hyperactive users, the people who literally are leaving like 100+ comments per hour, are worth behaving. And their moderation tools are not good enough to reliably catch this stuff. I mean, yes, if you do that day after day, you will probably run afoul, but like, you know, in terms of hate speech, they are proactively capable of pulling down 3%, roughly 3 to 4%. Now that's not saying they won't downrank more of it, but like point being in terms of comments and things like that, it's just going to be a really nasty world. And Facebook has, I think, not wanting to acknowledge this, but has altered products in some ways. So for example, for women in politics, there is such a thing as a constituent badge, which basically is a way to filter out people who are not in your district from commenting. And the reason you need that is because it turns out that like the total ass in Texas is very happy, like just absolutely slamming a congressional official in Minnesota, right? Like these people are they are truly borderless. They are extremely active. And so like, I think, you know, in terms of the worst stuff, like, I mean, TV Farms, for example, recently being taken down, like, as best I know, I'm, you know, look, there's always going to be some state actor tie-in with something like that, but it's really pretty organic. These people really are that awful, and they are very much empowered. And I think one of the things worth mentioning is that their tactics do work. Facebook's internal research does demonstrate that women in particular, and this is a truth for everyone in general, but women in particular are functionally silenced. In other words, their own content production reduces or falls when they are attacked. And whether or not things are accurate or credible doesn't really seem all that necessary. I think, you know, it's nasty, right? I mean, people have been worried about deep fakes and, you know, the idea that someone could be put into a convincing pornographic scene as a way of discrediting them in a lot of places. I guess what I would say is like a lot of what the internal Facebook understanding is it actually doesn't need to be credible.
Exactly.
It just needs to like literally like Photoshop, still, you know, cut out a head, put in a, you know, porn GIF, and there you have it. Like, that is the sort of thing that drives women offline. And so I think the disinformation focus on this is like perhaps almost the wrong focus. It really is just coalition-based fighting. And in terms of Facebook as well, they understand that engagement, I mean, their systems are, with some modification at this point, but certainly originally were built entirely to boost engagement of various metrics. And so that would be whether it's sessions, time spent, likes, that was abandoned a long time ago, some, you know, hybrid of all of these things. And it turns out that rage bait and hate bait are extremely successful tactics, which is that somebody doesn't necessarily have to violate the rules. If I just like post an article that is like, says something really like heated about Ilhan Omar, I will expect, and Facebook will, as documented, that basically that will result in a long thread of comments of people who are suggesting that she be killed, raped, or both, right? That's just like, and so it doesn't necessarily even require violations of rules. I mean, one could effectively harass female journalists without violating the rules of the platforms. And I think that's something that no one's really figured out how to deal with.
Can I add something to that? Because I think that's a great point. And one of the reasons when you hone in on journalism, journalists as a specific target, and why the disinformation issue falls in here is because of framing and agenda setting. So like typically, you know, journalists have played this role in the public sphere of helping to frame issues and set the agenda. now that there is this algorithmic intermediation, that it may very well be also, propelled by individuals, but the algorithms are now playing this framing and agenda setting role. So the more content, the more, engagement signals that you can generate, the harder it is to get away from, say, framing as a foreign agent or the smearing tactics and campaigns against women, or to get your frame of a specific issue out there because it gets drowned in other stuff. Similar with agenda setting. How do you try to set a public agenda when it is drowned out in all of this content, which again may very likely may not violate any standards, any terms of service or community guidelines, and so they can't get taken off. Which is why I think we have to look at the context where these, we know that there are reputation management firms and we know that there are state-based actors as part of a problem. So how could we also address like that dynamic, realizing it's not going to address all of these terrible people who just have somehow decided to like band together and target people. But with journalists, we do know that some of the investigative journalists and some of the leading and oftentimes only independent journalists in a given country are specifically targeted by state-based disinformation campaigns and online harassment. That's the unique thing I think that's a little bit different between kind of all women and journalists.
And they're being targeted specifically to silence them and
Correct.
specifically to deny them a public voice and a public standing, and simultaneously kind of discrediting the existence of facts and kind of like truth in the broader discussions that we had on disinformation anyway.
And yeah, I don't like, in the end, I don't know that gender is a convenient weapon at hand. It is, I mean, the reason there are, yes, absolutely going to be circumstances in which women will go online and receive, women journalists will go online and be treated terribly simply because of that. But if we're talking about the actual targeting of people, whether it's by organized actors or by sort of vigilante bands, it's not that the opposition is based on the speaker's gender. It's to the speech, and the gender is just simply the way they're choosing to go after it as a deeply unpleasant experience.
It's an additional tool to be weaponized and a very effective one.
Exactly. If the woman were saying or were producing news content that aligned with their beliefs, these folks would presumably be a lot more respectful. So it's like, it's not really I don't know. It is sort of an effort to silence women in an overall sensibility, so much as it is an effort to basically use the nastiest and societally most ingrained mechanism you can to, simply make it drive you offline.
And it's the easier, the more marginalized a group, an individual or a community is. Yeah. So there certainly this gender perspective comes in, as well as other intersecting factors, of course, because as you said, like it's also a societal issue, and it's the question which narratives can be used and can be weaponized for the silencing, and how effective the silencing will be depending on which of these identifiers are being used in the attacks. But of course, it's a broader discussion that we need to embed it into.
Platforms have been very bad about figuring out the hate bait, and that's on gender stuff as well, right? Which is that what you will have is an ecosystem in which a sizable publisher will produce content that is close to the edge, and that's enough to sick the crowd of idiots on the speaker in ways that go far beyond what the actual respectable entity is.
Thanks a lot. I just wanted to also touch upon two things. Follow up, first of all, you mentioned that it's not necessarily against the rules of the platform, but I think this is a conversation we need to have, like what are the rules and who sets the rules and who sets the global rules, linking back to what Courtney, what you said before. And then also that still, even though user engagement is not necessarily the only factor anymore, but it is still the priority that those platforms are putting into when we speak about content curation and content moderation, even if I think as you pointed out, and your work and the Facebook revelations pointed out very well, it's really, even if they're at odds with public interest in the broader sense, and with accuracy and with pluralism in that sense. I want to link, I mean, I want to open up. Before I open up, I also really want to mention, because I forgot it before, and I'm very sorry that this is co-hosted by API, this workshop. So also, of course, I mean, I think many of you will be familiar with the great work API is doing with On the Line, and also please, Javier and others, feel free to jump in at any point and to contribute to the discussion. Before I will also give the floor to colleagues, I just wanted to briefly re-mention the questions, because I'm not sure everyone received the concept note with the questions. Some of these were already touched upon now in this introductory part. We want to look at, of course, like the types and the methods of this online attacks against women journalists, including by using this information. And I think we already heard how they're very often really this orchestrated element, and it's really not about individuals only, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge much of this is organic and is boosted by the algorithmic kind of infrastructure that is provided. Then we also want to look at the role of platforms, or the role they are currently playing in the amplification of such violence. But really in this conversation today, we want to take it a step further and see what can we do about it, how can we respond, but also ideally change the system in a way that it's preventive, and that different stakeholders do so much great work on it, but how can we connect these dots, close the gaps between it, and really say where, what are the next steps in additional research, in advocacy, in diplomatic work, and also for us, and this is really also a little bit making use of the great minds in this room, also what we, for example, as an intergovernmental organization and working with the states, how can we better support the journalistic community and better address these issues in our work with governments and holding them to account? Because in the end, I think we all agree that different actors need to play a role, but also states have human rights obligations. They have positive obligations to make sure that journalists are protected, that women journalists are not being silenced. So how can we better work together at holding them to account as well? And platforms and society in the broader. So while opening the floor and also referring to this discussion, I want to first give the floor to Lucy, to our right, who is CPJ's emergency director, to also link the conversation a little bit more to the broader silencing kind of campaigns and orchestrated ways to attack journalism in a bit to shut them up. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Lucy Westcott. I'm the emergency director at CPJ, the Tech Journalist. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you, Courtney and Jess, for your remarks. My whole job is about journalism. I think, first of all, the Courtney's report should be required reading in every newsroom and frankly every journalism school. And I think we're really at a point now where news outlets and journalism schools really need to rethink how they are protecting certain acts. I joined CPJ in 2018 after having worked with journalism myself for many years. Like here in the US, I did, I personally experienced online harassment nowhere near to the extent of some of the journalists have written about in Courtney's report and some of the journalists. But my whole reason for joining CPJ was to make sure that that didn't happen, or didn't have to happen to other female journalists. What I can say is that we all know the overall goal is to silence and intimidate journalists, but the problem has gotten much worse. My role at the emergency department is to listen to journalists about what they need in terms of protecting themselves. What I did back in 2019 about online harassment resulted in several resources which we did create on our website, one of which is removing your personal data from the internet. There are ways that you can do this quite easily. In the US, it's really easy. In other countries, it is not. We really stress the need to do preventative work at the newsroom level, but also at the journalism school level. Start right at the beginning, your journalists, because they don't know what they're going to encounter even as students. I'll very quickly touch on what Jeff said about this being stereotypical work, and it's extremely important that we all work together. I want to highlight the fantastic work of the Coalition Against Online Violence. Many of you here, I think, know about the coalition. I would really encourage you to check it out. There's a fantastic resource on there. I think for many users and for many journalism tools, entering this space can be really intimidating. Where do I even start? How do I preventatively protect my journalists before something happens? Going to the coalition resource hub is a kind of start as well. And one thing I wanted to point out as well is that, you know, we've heard over the past few days so much about disinformation being, I think Sally Burton said, the defining problem of our generation. And she also said during that conversation at the town hall on Thursday that many of her journalists now, when harassment starts, at the asking for comment level. So we have heard from journalists that can be good, that just seeking a comment can then be taken as harassment, and then journalists will be harassed for that. So it all goes back to this point of the goal is to further discredit journalism. That's kind of an existential issue. But I'm here to kind of really hone in on how we can protect the journalists who are doing that work.
Thanks a lot. I want to maybe link this because you mentioned two things that reminded me also on the award ceremony yesterday. The journalists are kind of like always on the brink of heroism, which of course they should not need to. And it's the same that you are pointing out with regard to protection and protective mechanism that journalists need to do themselves, but also of course newsroom do have an responsibility, let's put it that way, to protect their journalists better. And then we have additional challenges when we speak about freelancing, etc. But maybe because I think it fits here very well, if I can come to you, Elena, from the trauma perspective, because I think you mentioned also this intimidation and this like really silencing, which of course is an impact on the broader pluralistic or the availability of pluralistic information, but also of course has an impact on the individual person. And there, what we heard this morning also was the data from the US context regarding self-censorship. And it would have been incredibly interesting, Drew, and I don't know whether Pan America also analyzed it from the gender perspective, whether there is even a bigger self-censoring effect of such attacks if the attacks are in a very sexualized manner, really refer to rape threats, death threats, and are using a gendered perspective in the attacks. So if you can refer to this also, because I know that you also always refer to self-care. So maybe this could be a nice putting it self-censorship next to self-care. Thanks.
Hi, everyone.
It is, yeah.
Okay, hi, everyone. And thank you to OSCE, BJ, and all the groups that work on this issue. I am with the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and I'm a psychologist. And I consider myself a journalist ally, so I come at this from a different perspective. But I think we are at this point where not only do we need to be talking about physical safety, but we need to be talking about psychological safety. And the way that this works is a psychological mechanism. Last night I went through and sort of looked at all the studies on online harassment, and self-censorship is often an outcome. The studies vary in their, I would say, rigor, but it does look like it is a difference for women. It does look like one of the biggest things that makes a difference is management support at an individual level. And that's something that I think we need to be starting and really working on, and starting from the time people are in journalism school as well. How can managers offer support that's meaningful? How can we be sharing information? The other thing that seems to be emerging as something that mediates long-term outcome is the sense of self-efficacy that a journalist has. And as we create policies, we need to also make those policies such that someone is not feeling even more helpless, because sometimes the policies are draconian. And I think that that is really hard. How do you find the right policy that protects somebody, but still gives the journalist the autonomy to make the choices that they need to make? Because one of the worst parts of trauma exposure is losing your voice. And some of our policies continue that. And I think that's something that I'd like to sort of raise, which is a different perspective here. I think from the start, just like we create physical health plans. What do you do before? What do you do during? And what do you do after? We're at a state, and it's terrible, where when you start a story, you need to start having, okay, psychologically, what am I going to do when the shit hits the fan, excuse my language, before, during, and after? Where are the places I can get support? What is going to make me crazy? What is not going to make me crazy? And I hate that we're at this place, but I think that has to be part of a plan for any story coverage in any context, in any country at this point, and particularly for women. The other thing that I wanted to mention, there was two other things that struck me as I was reading. I'm tired of the word online harassment. It's not online harassment.
Exactly.
It is real-time physical intimidation of journalists, and it is gendered, and it is misogynist. And there is a piece of it, and I don't know what better term. I turn to all of you who are journalists, who are word masters, but I think we need a better term for it, because we absolutely need that. And I think this isn't going to be easy. Everyone here cares. I don't think that newsrooms are intentionally places that try to be misogynist or try to not embrace diversity. I know that everyone here cares about that, but the data suggests that people who've come forward in their newsrooms haven't gotten support. And in fact, I can bore you with numbers. When people report, many people experience retaliation. And so we really, really need policies that address that. And I think those are my major points. Yeah. Oh, I'll say one other thing. The other thing that I think makes this worse is the uncertainty. We know, and we know this from COVID as well, uncertainty makes people much more subject to make bad choices, makes people nervous, and it can affect news judgment. And so the other piece of this that I think that is so hard, and that's why the work that all of you are doing are so important, is giving any sense of certainty and giving any sense of, again, power to counter the helplessness. And I think those are my contributions to this conversation for now.
Thanks so much for this. I mean, I think that, yeah, there are plenty of also aspects I know that you work on, so really feel free to jump in at any point. I just want to touch upon, because now I hope that we are moving also more towards this kind of solution, what can be done. And you already put something forward that is very concrete, which is like really providing this support and safety mechanisms within the newsroom, and also IPI does a lot of work with this safety protocols, because I mean we speak a lot today also about conflict, and rightly so, and safety that is necessary in this specific context, but at the same time there are also proof and evidence that reporting as a worst case, in that sense, minority woman journalists on a specific issue will lead to attacks and harassment. So there also need to be some safety protocols in place. So this is something that newsrooms, for example, can play. And I know that, for example, Pan America is also working on trainings, and really on trainings for the journalists on how they can do better. Then we have, of course, litigation as one of the options. So I think we have a lot of different perspectives in the room. So it would be really interesting to hear from you what you think has worked, which factors lead to different aspects. And of course, from the International Women's Media Foundation, also how it's all kind of like a vicious circle, because if women are attacked more, if women are not represented evenly in managerial editorial positions at the same time in the stories and in the coverage, it's all kind of linked to one another. So we really have to break free of this kind of like vicious circle to a specific degree. So please, you already have the microphone, because we want to give the microphone to everybody, just as Facebook does. So please.
Hi, I'm Elisa Liz-Munoz. I'm the executive director of the International Women's Media Foundation. I really feel like in the last couple of days, we really have let newsrooms off the hook, because I don't think that we can overstate how little is actually being done in newsrooms to protect women journalists when it comes to online violence and online harassment. Yes, it's a new situation, but women journalists have been experiencing online violence and online attacks for a really long time. And even, major media organizations in the US are not addressing this robustly, if at all. So I think one of the things we really need to focus on is the duty of care at media organizations and the lack of really reaching, the standard that one would expect, especially from well-resourced organizations, never mind organizations that aren't well-resourced. Just to a new resource that is going to come out in the next few days by the IWMF is a policy guideline for news organizations that has several case studies from the trainings that we've done for various size newsrooms, international newsrooms, US-based newsrooms, with templates that media organizations can use to survey their newsrooms. It's almost a how to implement this duty of care that is so desperately needed. And I think we all should focus on changing the culture of safety in these newsrooms. I think we've gone a long way in addressing a culture of safety in physical violence, but digital violence, where a lot of this physical violence is starting, has been woefully neglected.
The idea that was mentioned earlier that before, I would say that you're covering healthcare normally, or like hospitals, or banking, you probably don't need to worry about this. But I would argue that any reporter, certainly a woman who is going to be touching on societally conflicting, high societal conflict topics in their reporting, should probably be fully pardoned by the newsroom beforehand, right? In other words, you should expect that, like, okay, so like, let's say the rape threats start tomorrow. Does anyone have her address? Which is like, I think a really important thing, just to put a cap on, I guess, to mitigate. And I think it's another thing about, just in terms of preparation, I don't know there's much of a way. I mean, there is no way to shut down the actual harassment itself in a meaningful fashion. Maybe litigation in some instances, but this is not in a real-time situation, which is when the damage is done. It's not going to really help. The only thing I think that would be helpful from a platform mechanics point of view is to make sure that as a manager, you are explaining to reporters the mechanics of this, right? Which is that the platform, like let's say Facebook, Twitter, what have you, someone nasty has latched on to a post with a reasonably high profile, whether it is intentional or whether it is a sort of state sponsored or just some random jerk. And from there, they are basically going to be injecting that with the help of the platform's distribution into a social network of other nasty people who are then going to start piling on. And I think these humans are used to thinking that like our experience is somehow representative, that what is coming back to the world to us is in some ways like indicative of where the internet's at, which is of course completely wrong in this context, right? In a non-viral system, absolutely, right? People read your article, they leave comments at the bottom, no big, like some of them are going to be hateful, most of them aren't. There's not any link from one comment to the next. Whereas here, they are pretty much perfectly correlated. Like once you start going down a bad road, it will just get worse and worse until time passes and something takes it.
Yeah, no, it's very important to underline that in the distribution system that we are currently having, it's not a reflective reflection of the world and of the opinions out there. But I think it's also important to point out to this, currently we're in this reactive phase and always only trying, and we discussed this briefly before, always only trying to address things that have already happened. But at the same time, you rightly pointed out the distribution mechanism. So maybe this could also be something where we can try to step in a little bit earlier and to get into some preventive mechanisms. And I see already several people, but you have the microphone.
I just want to say one thing quickly about prevention, and prevention is hard because you want to deny this is going to happen. You want to deny that you're not going to be vulnerable. You want to feel powerful. And that's why I think policies and procedures need to come forward, because as individuals, I thank you all for being here and thinking about this. This is hard to think about. It really comes to the core of an identity of a journalist to be able to report on what they want to report. So the idea of being attacked for it is just so upsetting that we need those policies.
Can I just jump in on one thing because I haven't it attached to my blouse. I think we need to get specific, like now, and we're doing this. Like the Coalition for Online Violence is looking at the individual level, the newsroom level, the platform level, and maybe at some point the governmental level. And I think we as a community need to do that. Within each of those kind of levels and types, the responses and what can be done are going to vary. Individuals and state-sponsored disinformation, there's very little and any individual can do. Maybe more that a newsroom can do with their responsibility to a journalist, but that's where you need governmental and platforms to come in and do something. So I think we need to look at kind of the typology of harms, of types of online harassment, because that's another thing, this terrible term that really obscures the violence and whatever. You all know this, but we need to then get specific. Okay, what's different from a DDoS attack and a smearing campaign? What happens when there's synthetic media? And what happens when this is, at the state coordinated level? What about if it's an individual user? Like we need to get, I think, a lot more specific so that we can come up with the right solutions for the right perpetrators, for the right time incident, the kind of time frame as well, because governmental and platform level solutions are not rapid response, whereas that's what you need at the individual newsroom level. So, we were doing some of this work at CPJ. I think we're doing it in the coalition. All of these groups are doing a lot of really useful things. So if I had a recommendation to the OSCE, would be to map it out and which groups are working on what dimensions, where should we focus our efforts and create a strategy for changing things? Because again, to the context, if you've got an entire multi-million-dollar industry that is being used by government officials, that's something that you don't need the platforms to change their policies on. You need government, OSCE member governments, to, I don't know, make a commitment not to hire reputation management firms or to fix their laws or whatever. So I think that would be really helpful for moving the conversation forward.
And just to add another layer, and then I will give you the floor in a second, then again, reactive versus preventative.
Exactly.
I think what we discussed before, to also identify on which level, which method, by whom, who can step in to respond, but at the same time to prevent it amplifies and comes again. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kate Spee Holmes. Up until a few days ago, I was the deputy editor of the Media Manipulation Casebook at the Technology and Social Change Center at Shorenstein Center. I was also a fellow and an IWMF fellow during the pandemic, very early pandemic days, of reporting fellow for the IWMF. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we at the Media Manipulation Casebook have been documenting in terms of methods. These aren't random. There are patterns in the way that people attack journalists online and others online, the way they go after a story, the way they create a news cycle that might be fraudulent or defamatory. So I encourage you all to check out mediamanipulation.org, because we've done this very forensic documentation of both the tactics and the strategies of media manipulation. And if you can document the life cycle of one of these campaigns, which may be a disinformation campaign, it may be a harassment campaign, they share, whether it is disinfo or harassment or misinfo or accidental misinfo, they tend to share characteristics from the origins of the campaign to the spread, to the response, to the attempts to mitigate it, and to then how the original campaign operators respond to those mitigation attempts. Do they just pivot? Do they give up? Rarely, we find, occasionally, but rarely do they just stop the harassment. They often pivot to a new tactic and a new strategy, and the campaign starts afresh and the cycle starts afresh. So I think from the preventative, both from the preventative and responsive perspective, learning that cycle and being able to identify it in the beginnings and knowing which kinds of mitigations work best at which stage of the cycle can be very important. Because if you use a mitigation tactic that's effective, like debunking at a certain stage, but you do it too late, the story is already spread. If you pre-bunk too early, you actually risk spreading the story yourself. So I think that's important for newsrooms to really learn and understand where they need to intervene, and also sort of fact-checking organizations and organizations committed to fighting these tactics. I also just want to add, jumping back from solutions and prevention to problems, sorry. I did want one thing I've noticed about gendered harassment that I think is specific to women is that in calling out the harassment, there's a gendered attack on you for doing so. You're a crybaby, you're a weak woman, maybe you're a bitter woman, you're just angry. And it makes it harder for women who are harassed to actually denounce the harassment because there's a gendered response to that. It also, in many countries where women and journalists in general are killed more frequently, to go to the international level, which is my background, international editing and reporting, there can be a gendered investigative response from the authorities when women are attacked, actually raped, harassed, threatened, or killed. I was listening to a podcast from Open Democracy the other day looking at a 2012 case of a Veracruz reporter in Mexico, a woman who was killed, and the authorities said it was her boyfriend. And he was a drug dealer, and it was a crime of passion. And they used passion and romance to explain the absolute violence where she had been beaten so horrifically. Oh, sure, because she's a woman, it was her boyfriend. It was a gendered attack. It was a feminicide, but it wasn't because of her journalism. It was because of her womanness. So there's that complicated response where gender can be used against women after the fact as well, which I think, and I don't have a solution for this at all, I think needs to be taken into account in the responses. Think about how it's different to respond to an attack on a woman journalist because of the ways that people discount her after the fact as well.
It's a very important aspect. Thank you for bringing it up also, because I think it's really also the question of access to power and decision-making on all levels, because it's also after, it's during the attack, but it's even before, like who is even, for whom it is already more difficult to bring up your voice and to get to this public stage at all, that puts you more in the spotlight. And I think there is plenty of evidence by now also that attacks on an individual woman journalist has an impact on other women journalists, and on also other women in the public sphere who are not journalists or who don't even think about getting into that profession. And I think somebody also yesterday quoted the UNESCO study that evidence that 1 out of 3 women journalists has thought about quitting because of online attacks, or like online attacks, offline attacks, attacks on them because of their work using gendered narratives and stereotypes. Yes, first to you, you were first, then to Pen, and then thanks.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm Ruth Donberg, and I'm original previous narratives. A lot has been said already, but I do want to add to that, because there are several issues, I think. One of them is the psychosocial effects, which you already mentioned. The mental health issues are underrepresented and understated often, especially in countries where, I mean, here in the West, mental health issues is normal part of life. But in a lot of countries and communities, that is not the case. It's still a taboo, and we should actually work on that as well. And secondly, we already discussed this successfulness of silencing women journalists by attacking them online. They practice indeed self-censorship, and they decide to not be active anymore on social media platforms. Well, especially for women journalists, this is also critical for them. They produce their report and actually doing their job. So, and the cases of, because you, Jeff, mentioned that it's often single gender related, but it's also work related. Studies show that when women report on women's rights issues and human rights issues, they're more often attacked because of that. So there should be more research on that as well. That is what we think. When it comes to the platforms, in a lot of countries there are no escalation channels. So there are no ways for women to escalate their problems. And also it differs also from country to country what is sensitive and what is not sensitive. So it should be contextualized also. That is something that actually together we could strive for. That there is in every country an escalation channel. Platforms, to our opinion nowadays, get away with this because they can actually look at it as an incident or an isolated case or a national case, where that is not the fact. It is systematically, it is globally. And we should have more data so we can actually confront them with this. And then they should be taken action on. And we could also advocate better in that sense to force them to do something about it. And lastly, and that is, I think, where Alina can speak more about. There is also no clear definition when it comes to online harassment. Where do you have to draw the line? When is it a criminal offense? And this actually fuels the impunity because it's a gray area. And governments simply don't have the regulations or the needs to act on it. So that is also something, especially states, governments, and other stakeholders which actually work on.
Just want to, or you want to respond immediately? Yeah. Yeah.
Respond.
Yeah.
Whenever you want to go first.
No, I just wanted to link it again to this gender element that is also depending on the topic that you speak about, that you mentioned, that links again to this, that there is a gendered element on kind of like every level of it that needs to be addressed. But my other point I forgot, so please, Jeff, you wanted to respond immediately, and then I will give the floor to Penn America, and then to you. Thanks.
So I think I agree with all of those goals. I think some of the things that would be good to have are simply not possible in the ecosystem. So a functional channel for reporting that would manage to provide prompt remediation. There is no platform on a global scale that is capable of providing it. It's just simply technically not remotely feasible. If you think about also the amount of, this is an extremely low margin business in the sense of how much each user is worth. And there will never be moderation that's capable of this. The AI focus that, I mean, yes, you can do better on it, and they should, but this is not going to get out of that hole. They simply technically can't at that scale. I think the two things on the platform level, and in terms of the idea of people getting hassled further when they speak up, this is unfortunately again just a nature of the engagement-based system, which is the people who attack fucking love it when like you rebroadcast the terrible things that they've done. It's they do not need the trolls, unfortunately does apply here. The two things that I think on a platform level would be really meaningful and might be worth people who are in the advocacy world considering is, first of all, trying to prevent offline or sort of off-platform and frequently encrypted organizations from forming. So, for example, and at least create some friction. So, for example, WhatsApp groups that then coordinate things on Facebook. They recruit on Facebook, then the conversation goes to WhatsApp, then the coordinated behavior goes back on Facebook. Friction there is basically the only defense. And I think one thing that's really interesting in the US is that after the recent Nebraska semi-abortion related issue, I don't want to get into too much of the details of the case, it's actually complicated. There was an extreme push to encrypt Messenger, which actually does create exactly that interface that arguably makes bad action much easier. And then the second part is just that the limitation on virality is basically the single biggest thing that actually could be done to improve the experience and limit harassment, because it stops that chain of one asshole spreading it to a larger group of assholes who then, like that. So those are, yeah, but on an individual level, I don't know what could be done other than asking reporters early on to think through these issues and prepare for it, and unfortunately suck it up, because that is, I hate saying that, it sounds awful, particularly from a man, But I don't understand, I don't see an opportunity like anywhere inside the platform to actually improve the experience on an individual basis. You could do it on the platform level, but the individual level right now, that's a rent.
But then
you
maybe
could-
the.
You could, if you identify
Sure.
journalists on the platform.
And maybe
right?
then the platform itself is structured in a way that is problematic when we speak about
Yes.
the ecosystem of engagement and surveillance-based advertising and virality. So just not discussing this, then maybe we need to address the broader picture of platforms if there is no feasible solution in the current ecosystem.
Of course, in the beginning you mentioned that it's all about engagement for them, right? 50% of the world are women. If they're not engaged anymore in platforms, it affects them also. So, I mean, they have to think of long-term mechanisms to actually deal with this.
Right, but defining harassment, for example, online more clearly, it won't work, unfortunately, because you can have a better rule, but like they're not capable of enforcing even the grossly deficient, extremely blunt rules, right? Like, and so coming up with sort of something more nuanced is you'll be fighting over what a policy should be when it's impossible for them to even come close to enforcing the half-assed version. That makes sense.
But you could combine the news integrity efforts and the efforts to identify like actual news sources and use that signaling to influence the algorithmic amplification or access to a person rather than an algorithm when an attack starts taking place. They're doing these separate streams of work that could actually feed into each other to help improve, at least on journalists, because it's not scalable to everybody. But if we're just talking about journalists,
there are greater protections for journalists already, as bizarre as that may sound. Actually, if you have a
in the US,
if you work for and abroad, if you work for a sizable known outlet, you already are receiving a better version of Facebook and I believe other platforms than the standard user would. But I think also virality isn't just an issue, or the amplification isn't just an issue that have algorithms, right? It's also what is the retweet button. And you can have
The infrastructure.
the design,
it's just very hard to think about how making it stop without fundamentally altering the platform seems to be nearly impossible.
Then maybe we need to have this conversation. And also, I think I just wanted to, I feel as a representative of the OSCE, which also covers a lot of regions where we have very repressive governments. Unfortunately, I just feel the need to also mention, even though encryption brings challenges with it, of course, it adds another layer of complexity, the need of anonymity, encryption, and the same also with the definition of harassment, where unfortunately we have seen that very often can also be used for censoring. But now finally, two statements that we wanted to have for a while, please.
Hi,
Cecilia, go ahead.
yes, I'm Jamila Salama on the digital safety team at Penn America and then also research assistant with the media manipulation casebook. I wanted to circle for a little bit back to newsroom policies. And I think when we're obviously all searching for solutions, but sometimes we forget that you have journalists in your newsrooms telling you exactly how they want to be supported. And when we have, I think, newsroom leaders sitting and thinking about what can we do? What are the protocols? It's sometimes it's right there in front of you, and sometimes it's just about opening up space to let journalists feel heard, let them tell you how they want to be supported and helped, and then working with them to implement those policies and solutions. And then going back to thinking about platforms, I do think there are short, immediate solutions and product features that could be implemented in making users feel more empowered. And that is as simple as reporting features, like I think Instagram rolling out limits, Twitter having unmentions. Those are really great tools that people can use to remove themselves from situations by untagging themselves, by limiting who can see their profile. And I think that there are a lot of really great ways to make the reporting systems on platforms a lot more accessible, easy to use. And it doesn't have to be this platform-wide policy that needs a new team. It could just be introducing a feature that allows people to you know, like when you block, report, and those are great things that make you have immediate short-term differences that I think we could focus on more as well.
Thanks a lot. Can you please pass over the microphone? Thanks a lot.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a journalist with the Daily Maverick in South Africa. We actually did a documentary this year on online violence against women journalists in South Africa. We focused on 4 journalists, Feriol Haffeji, Polly van Wyk, Marianne Tam, and Karin Dolly, who are brilliant investigative journalists who have been really facing like terrible online violence. And the reason why, I mean, there's few questions, and it was really great. This discussion is so necessary. The first thing, I don't know if there's anyone from Google or Facebook in the room, but I think that would be crucial every time those discussions happen. We are social media platforms, and they need to be in the room also to understand what's happening. The second thing is, while we were filming, and it goes on to what you were saying, Feriol, who's been a journalist, a veteran journalist for many, many years during apartheid, and now obviously, and mentioned the parallel between the violence during apartheid times and online violence. And she was saying, to your point, they received specific training to be on the front line during protests covering apartheid. And so they knew how to deal with that kind of violence. And they don't know how to deal with online violence. And it's a big, and like you said, what I love, and it's not just for women, actually, it's not gendered, it's training for everyone in the newsroom, because men know what's happening. And anyone who actually is a journalist should be aware of what's going on once you put a story and it's been published and you're the recipient of violence. The second thing is, a lot of those journalists, when we interviewed them for the film, they mentioned accountability. All of them said, you know, I'm a journalist. When I put a story out there, I am accountable for what I say. I am accountable for every word that I put out there. My newsroom it's got a code of ethics. We have an ombudsman that we report to if something goes wrong, that we have to explain where our facts and everything. And that goes completely out the window for Meta. And I know what you said, that it's too big of a task now, because they are so huge, and to ask them to have the fact checkers and moderators, but surely we need to ask. I mean, Maria Ressa yesterday was talking about it. We need accountability for those platforms. We need to be able to tell them. And there is also a difference, which you mentioned as well, between platforms in different countries. Talks about neocolonialism in terms of how Facebook and Twitter deals with South Africa and South African journalists compared to journalists in the West. And so there's so many things, like I'm just amazed from representative here that we can address this issue, because they need to do something. It's more than that. It's within the newsrooms as well. But we need to be able to sit down and really talk about where do we go from here. That they are so powerful, and then so not accountable.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we all agree on the lack of accountability, and I mean, there are of course several initiatives to try to address this. But it is unfortunately not easy to get them not only to listen, but also to improve the system. But I mean, of course, like initiatives and reporting and pressure by civil society and international organizations is already taking place. But I fully agree, and I think everybody does, that it's not on a sufficient level. But maybe when we speak about accountability, because already Ruth put you already on the spot, maybe I can continue with that, because this is an angle that I think is also very interesting. We haven't really spoken about. Even though litigation, of course, is again very individual on individual cases, it's very reactive, and it's a very long process of accountability in individual cases, but it can also lead to some changes, at least theoretically, or that's the ideal. Is there anything also, listening to the conversation so far and from your experience, where you say there's really this one aspect where you think litigation would be improved or would make litigation unnecessary because the system itself would be improved?
Well, I was going to say, my background is in law and we started with these things. It's very, very difficult to achieve anything by working through courts, I think. We have tried though, because you cannot really do nothing. So one of the things that we have been doing is trying to work through domestic courts. First, there's all domestic remedies, then take the case of regional courts. We try to push for clearer standards in international human rights laws on what are the obligations of states whenever journalists are part of the decision. So what kind of remedy do they need to state? What kind of remedy would actually be effective? So I think it's very a piece of result as well. And then how should they conduct effective investigations? How do they conduct things like that? And it's been extraordinary complex. But and so as well, of course, with litigation. But some of the things that we have had some success with, for instance, encouraging journalists to report, to seek legal support in the early stage, link them to specialist evidence gathering organizations to make sure it's good work. They did to do all of that work by themselves and relive the online violence that they faced. Then present the case to a prosecutor with the help of an expert lawyer, so that they are not sitting there by themselves getting a response, you know, that is not taking them seriously or is finishing their experience and so on. So these are some of the small things that we've been trying to do. Like I said, litigation takes a very long time, so we're still waiting to see what will happen involved. But yeah, that's basically our 2 cents from a litigation point of view. Things that we've been trying to do. Can I answer that?
Yes, just one additional question that I will throw on, and then you can take it from there immediately, because you said that there should be remedies also for states to address to. But do you have an example? Is there something that in your cases you say this would be a remedy, or in a specific case this worked very well and we had this one mechanism in place that was useful? Is there something concrete that you can bring to this? Sorry for putting you on this one. I was hoping we could now finally.
Although there are, but it's the active case, but we do have examples of where we can support women who are victim of online violence. But there is an online platform called Totem, which actually for free gives online trainings for women journalists, digital training how to better be prepared. So there are things actually experienced with trusted peer circles, where women find support with each other, which is very successful. And we're also setting up holistic in-person trainings, and we want to contextualize them because in different situations in different countries, women needs also different kind of therapies. So
One step at a time.
One step at a time.
Exactly. Yes, please. And then.
Okay, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. My name is Lowita. I wanted to find out, I'm just trying to get an understanding of, let's say, international best practices in terms of legal frameworks. So, can you make reference to that, what you're using? My understanding from some of the cases that I followed is that it's largely tribal laws, laws around incitement of, violence and violence and hate speech that have been used, and have those been effective?
So it very much depends on the form of online violence. So for instance, some of the cases that we've taken relate to hacking or DDoS attacks. And we work globally. So each time it's a matter of figuring out what it look like, where can we, what happened exactly under criminal law provision can we, fit that. So Yeah, it really depends. But generally speaking, within the criminal law framework, for the most egregious forms of online violence, we would be able to find something. And then argue that there was a violation of that, push for an effective investigation by the state. Typically, we then deal with unwillingness to investigate for whichever reason. For instance, they don't take it seriously, or the state was behind the attack, so they won't investigate. So then it's a matter of working your way through the domestic courts, exhausting all of the remedies, and going to the regional court, where eventually you will be able to, for instance, prove that this constitutes a violation of the right to freedom of expression, that someone was targeted because of their journalistic work. So those are some of the arguments that we're making. But it will take a couple of years for those judgments to come out and for that then to be implemented and so on. So it's definitely very much a long-term. I don't want to say solution, but it's one of the things that you can try for the long term.
Thanks a lot. Yes, please.
From my vantage point as a dean of a journalism school, the question that strikes me immediately is about the best practices for educating journalists who are going into the field, how much work there has been done around that. And particularly Courtney and also the psychologist, I didn't quite hear your name, about what sorts of things journalism students should be educated about as they're going out into this environment.
Sure. I mean, just off the bat, I think introducing them to the world of support mechanisms that exist, like the Coalition for Online Violence is the perfect place, like very easy. All the groups are there. If you're not, join. The resources are all there. So that's like the practical side of things. Then I think, journalism students need to not just learn how to produce journalism. That's not sufficient in this day and age. We are in the era of the platformatization of journalism. And so they need to understand the dynamics that journalism is entering into, which will help them, publish their journalism and get it out there. But as part of that, to understand the role that disinformation and online harassment plays in that, they I think have to be aware that that is part of the conditions of the field. If you're a firefighter, you know that you're running into fires. If you're becoming a journalist, you know that online harassment is going to be part of the conditions in which you work. And so then, hopefully that can help, develop some resilience. I think also then looking at, I think journalism schools in general on safety are not where they need to be. All forms of safety, right? I think there are maybe a handful of universities now. When I was the advocacy director at CPJ, there were 0 journalism schools with safety courses. I'm pretty sure that's starting to shift, but we need to approach safety holistically, where online harassment is an element of that. I totally agree the term is terrible. We really should just be talking about abuse, threats, and violence against journalists. Sometimes they are coming via WhatsApp. Sometimes they're coming from the stalker that shows up, at your door. So that would be helpful, I think, to embed safety into the curriculum as a core part of the curriculum. And just the last thing, and Lucy will kill me if I don't say this, but you have to do the what's the risk assessment? Thank you. The risk assessment. You need to do risk assessments before you go out and report. I mean, you've suggested this with every story, or at least if you're doing a series of stories, you need to do the risk assessment, whether it's the physical, the digital, the psychosocial, the mental health aspects, safety aspects that are involved in that story. Just as you're going to map out who are you going to interview, where do you need to go? Part of that has to be your risk assessment for the various different safety factors. So I'd like to see a risk assessment built in to reporting classes, to content-based classes.
Yeah, and sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
All right, thank you so much. And it's true that you really have seen a lot of deep courses on this subject, but I do want to point out that a lot of global reporting has focused on this for a long time. So for example, in Colombia, we have conflict reporting classes that get into this deeply. And so I think maybe in more recent years, there's been within the pandemic and
in this sort of rise in attacks on media in the United States, people are drawing from those lessons of this rich history versus lessons. So if you're looking for resources, you know, many of these conflict reporters and rural journalists have been turning some of this material around to be a little bit more accessible to other fields, but that's also a good place to learn as well. Sort of kind of digging into it, in addition to like IWMF and some of the resources that have been brought up. I really recommend.
Yes, and if
I
I
have
could,
a redacted syllabus on my website that I'm also happy to show.
really covered the most of it. I've come to speak at Columbia a few times. Just on a risk assessment as well, that can be quite an intimidating term. Oh my God, why do I have to do a risk assessment if I'm going to go and cover a protest down the road from to school? They don't have to be lengthy, but what they should absolutely include identity, and identity is really important. So in many ways, your identity could be a risk. In many other ways, it's an absolute asset. And these things need to be figured out within a risk assessment as well. I think Courtney's absolutely right in that student journalists now should expect something to happen, whether that is online or in person or in some other way. I would also argue that student journalists are a particular risk because people who attack journalism as an institution probably so they are open and vulnerable in that way.
And then the other thing I think I would add is preparing them for the difficulties psychologically. And I also think social media policies need to start early on. We have in psychology where people are starting to really think about their presence and how they want to change it or not. And that needs to start the minute someone decides. And I hate that that's the case. And many of my students have say, I want to be able to be visible. It's like, well, then you can make those choices.
Used to be.
Yeah, or start from the outset. You're talking to students, have them create their professional profiles and their personal at the very beginning so that you're starting. They don't have to get rid of everything they've done, but like make that private for their friends and start a new professional identity.
We have one additional comment from there. And then
oh yeah, this was pretty quick. All these great things that people have talked about. Is there a good resource that CPJ or one of those other organizations have for just sheets? Like what would be the best sheet location?
The Coalition Against Online Violence. It's what the COAV.org or Coalition.
Coalition Against Violence Resource Hub. You go on that, you can also choose who you are. Are you a journalist? Are you an editor? Are you an ally? And then it's kind of like a choose your own adventure system. So it's all that.
okay. So we only have 15 more minutes for the lunch break, and I really don't want to stand between you and your sandwiches, but this has been really phenomenal, but I also don't want to cut anyone off. So please, you still wanted to say something, Drew? No.
I just want to ask one.
Yes.
Sorry. In terms of national program, make an assessment whether or not teaching the journalists about their social media presence and profile. Because I can't see them in any code of it.
Because it's not as ethical.
I've had this discussion with so many young female journalists, especially female journalists who want to be very visible as journalists and also as models and as, you know, they don't break the distinction, and it's so important because what you say on social media is also at risk for report. And if you are going to be biased for a particular topic, that is going to be. So I mean, the ethical issues, it's another discussion.
And they're part of the risk assessment in this context as well. Drew, you still wanted to say something? Okay, then I just want to say this has been really phenomenal. I'm so grateful for all of your contributions. I think really, even though there are still no responses or definite answers to the challenges, I think we have come a step closer. Thank you for bringing all your different perspectives to this table.
Yeah,
thank you. I really think the closest we come is to there are so many different steps. There's so many different actors, and they all need to play a role, and we really need a whole of society approach. We need responsibility of newsroom, of platforms, of governments, of international actors, but also as more safety and trainings for the individuals that are involved without putting it on their shoulders only. So thank you so much once again. We will certainly continue this conversation. Did I already say thanks? I think so. So thanks, and enjoy your sandwiches for the rest of the day.